Hey, welcome back. Hope you had a great spring break. Well, I had a pretty good spring break, but I have to begin this week's video lecture and our return to the semester with an apology and an admission. It seems I've made a huge mistake in the syllabus. So pay attention here as I give you some important news. I made a mistake in the syllabus about the due date for Essay 3, so that is going to change some things up for you. So pay attention, write this down. Your syllabus, it says Essay 3 is due this week. No, Essay 3 is due next week. So again, Essay 3 is due April 3rd. That's going to be next Friday. So obviously I did not proofread my syllabus carefully enough before I gave it to you this semester. So that's going to be a good lesson on why proofreading is important, right? So that's going to be something that I blog about this week. So look out for my blog later today. We'll have some reflections on proofreading, why it's important, and ways to go about doing it better, because we all always need to work on our proofreading, right? Even me, I admit it, I make mistakes sometimes. So I apologize for the confusion. Again, Essay 3 is not going to be due this week, it'll be due next week, so that will be Friday, April 3rd. That's when your essay is due, and I will remind you of that in many different ways as the week goes on, okay? So that makes this week a lot easier than it originally looked. This week we're just going to kind of ease back into the routine, right? We'll ease back into our regular routine. You've got 2 chapters to read, one from the Norton Field Guide and one from the Guide to Research and Writing. So you'll have 2 quizzes, one each. And you, of course, need to blog. And I recommend highly that you, as you're blogging in these last few weeks of the semester, you're really using that space to kind of reflect on what's going on with your paper and stuff like that. So what you're going to read about in your guide to research and writing at Oklahoma State is about finding your perspective, sort of using triangulation, is what Hillary Conant talks about in that chapter. And it's a helpful chapter, and I recommend paying good attention to it. You'll be quizzed on it, obviously. It really helps you to find your perspective, and that's what the research narrative is all about. You've done the research, right? You've read all of these sources, you found all these sources, you read them, you made your annotated bibliographies, which I'll be returning to you within the week. They look really good, so good job. Pat yourselves on the back. I'll get those back to you, but you've done all that work, right? Now it's time to figure out what it is. You probably already know this. You probably have, as you've done the research, if you've been taking my advice about letting the research guide you to a stance and a position, a perspective on the subject, then you probably already have an idea of where you're going, right? So the next assignment, Essay 3, then, is going to be figuring out where you're going and articulating it in writing, right? And so I think the best way to do that, the most effective way to do that, is by telling a story, right? So that's what Chapter 40 in your Norton Field Guide is all about, is how to write a story, a narrative, right? That's what you'll be looking at. That's what you're going to be doing for Essay 3. You're going to be telling the story of your research, as I pointed out in our video lecture 2 weeks ago. So I want to give you some thoughts today that will go along with what you read in both of your textbooks this week. Some thoughts on how to write a narrative, how to tell a story, some of the basic ideas of storytelling as we understand it. So let's talk about that now. So you may have seen this before. This is Freytag's triangle, which is sort of the basic structure of a narrative, and it's very important to keep this in your heads as you're working on telling your stories, the stories of your research. First of all, you see it's a movement, it's a process, it's a line, just like your research has been, and then it goes through very specific points, right? So we're going to talk about what each of these points is and how it might look for your paper. First is, of course, the exposition, which is basically the setup, right? And so some classic ones like "It was a dark and stormy night," or "A guy walks into a bar" for a joke, right? Or something more appropriate to this topic would be the idea of, it was time to choose a topic to research. And so you're setting up the story of what's going on in your research, right? The next point is the rising action, or the plot thickens, right? So something in a story, normally, a conflict is introduced, right? So something happens that makes the tension arise. That's the introduction of conflict there, and it makes the plot move forward. So something that you might use, I thought I knew all there was to know about sports injuries, and then I did some research, right? The conflict here is the research. It's your struggle for knowledge is what this story is all about, your quest for an argument. So you should include here a few of the sources that maybe most influenced your journey, and show how these sources help move you from not having an idea toward having an idea. Along that way, of course, you're going to have that aha moment, right? That moment where you suddenly know what your argument is, right? That's the climax, right? When things get most intense in a story, and that's the moment where you sort of figured out what you wanted to say about your topic, right? Now I have an idea, I have a stance, I have a position. This is the moment. The most important moment in any story is, of course, its climax. So the most important moment of your research narrative is the moment when you realize what you're going to do, right? And then after the climax, most stories, most good stories anyway, have a nice falling action, or denouement, right, which is the French word for falling action, or resolution, right? This is where your story gets wrapped up nice and neat so that it makes good sense, right? That will look something like, now that I've done this research, now that I've just showed you my story, and learned all this, here's what I'm going to be arguing in Essay 4, right? I really want this paper, Essay 4, to begin with, I didn't know what I was going to say about this topic. I'm interested in it. I might have known some things, but I didn't have an argument, and end with, now here's my argument, right? Here is where I'm going. So keep in mind that Essay 3 is the story of your research process, right? It's your story. You can tell it however you want, but some things to consider, of course, are how did it begin, right? What did you start with, right? What prior knowledge did you start with? What keywords, what research questions. So go back, maybe look at those discussion boards, look at some blogging that you did. You can use any of that stuff to help you draft Essay 3. When, where, how did it get interesting? Where did things change for you? What sources had the biggest influence on how you are currently thinking about your topic, right? So how has your stance helped you develop an argument? And now what's next? What will you be working on? What will be your working thesis as you start to draft Essay 4? All right, so there's my sort of how to tell a story in 5 minutes lecture, right? You've got some things to think about there, though. If you keep in mind those points, the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement, resolution, all that good stuff. I think you're gonna find that this paper is not only easier to write, but also a lot of fun. I've had students do really interesting work with the research narrative before. Again, it's your story, so tell it however you want to. I don't mind. I've had students make me a character where I'm like the evil wizard who gave them some task, and it's fun to read, it's fun to write. That's fine. Just keep in mind you need to include a few of your sources and really show me how the research moves you from not having an argument to having an argument. But aside from that, however you want to tell it, that's up to you. I expect you, and I highly encourage you to get creative and really enjoy this process. It's a chance to sort of take a step back from all the really intense work that you've been doing in researching, and all the really intense work that you're going to do in writing Essay 4, and really take a step back and reflect on the process. Think about how your sources and how your work has led you to this point where you now have something to say, hopefully. And maybe if you're kind of in a position where you're not sure you have something to say yet, maybe writing down the story and really thinking about how everything has moved in terms of exposition, rising action, climax, and falling action. Maybe that'll help you sort of start to see where your argument is. So that's really the goal here, and that's what I want you to be working on in the next couple of weeks as you blog and think and read. Next week we will be reading a chapter on specifically research narratives to give you some better ideas about what that is. If you want to go ahead and get started with that, I highly recommend it. But do the reading that's assigned for this week. Take your quizzes, all that good stuff. And be thinking about how you want to tell your story. What's your story been here in terms of figuring out what your argument is going to be. So let me know if you have any questions. Here's your to-do list for this week, and I'll talk to you all later. All right, so as I just said, you need to read and take your quizzes, of course. Will be up for you here in just a minute. Blog, and read my blog, which will be up later today on Monday, about proofreading and other things. And then, of course, start thinking about how to shape your research narrative and maybe start drafting it. Perhaps you can use your blog as an opportunity to start writing and thinking about how you want to tell your story. A lot of you have already begun to tell your story in your blogs and in your discussion board responses. And so feel free to pick stuff from there and use that in your research narratives. That's fine. And of course, let me know if you have any questions. I'll be available. Talk to you next week.